You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is episode 13, titled Your Wounds and the Path to Healing. In today's show, I'm going to talk about three things related to wounding and healing of the heart. First is how your heart has been wounded. The second is how your wounding is linked to the particular ways that you find yourself enslaved. And the third is, what is the path toward healing? What does it look like? The world we inhabit is not as it should be. I think that's a rather uncontroversial statement. In biblical language, we live in a world marred by sin. And because of that, we've all been wounded by the sin of another person. Everyone has been wounded. Each of us have been harmed by the sin of other people. And I imagine that many of you agree that we live in a sinful world, that we live in a world of harm. But how many examples can you give of how the sinfulness of the world has marred you? How sin has cut into your heart? How has your heart been harmed by the sin of others? Where has the shrapnel of this world lodged in your body? Many of you are quite willing to name your sin, quite willing to name your failures, but sometimes it's much harder to name the ways that you have been sinned against. Your heart has been injured. It has been wounded. And what I'd like to do today is to talk about the wound, what it is, why it matters, and what can be done about it. So first, what it is. When I was in 7th grade, I didn't have a lot of hair on my legs, and a kid said I shaved my legs, and he started a rumor that eventually went around the whole school. There were 2 to 3 kids who were kind of the ringleaders, and when I would pass them in the halls, they would yell, "Shave your legs," or they would make buzzing sounds like an electric razor. And I froze. I was petrified. Pretty soon, everyone thought I shaved my legs, and people would make fun of me, and I didn't know how to make it stop. Now, when you're a 7th grade boy who is becoming a man, this kind of thing rips your guts out. I was being made fun of for being like a girl. My budding sense of masculinity was assaulted. My heart was wounded. It was injured a little bit each day. And as bad as all that was, it wasn't actually the deepest wound. The deeper wound was that I was alone in my pain. My parents knew what was going on. They knew I was filled with dread every day before school. We talked about it, but they weren't willing or able to talk with me about what I was experiencing and help me to process it. So they knew it was going on, but there was no engagement with me about how to cope with it, how to deal with the mockers, the boys that were teasing me. Thompson is a Christian neuroscientist who's done a lot of work on understanding how our relationship with our parents affects our brains. And he's got a great way of getting at what I'm trying to say. This is how he puts it. We can grow up in homes in which the food finds the table, the money finds the college funds, and the family even finds the church each Sunday. But somehow our hearts remain undiscovered by the 2 people we most need to know us, our parents. My heart was undiscovered by my parents. My dad was emotionally checked out. A young boy needs his father to step in and engage with him when something like this is happening. If the father doesn't, the boy's broken heart gets scooped up and mashed back together in a way that doesn't allow mending. And it will shape his experiences for many years to come. And I began carrying this broken, mashed together, but not quite right heart. God created each of us with a question deep in our guts. We're born with it. And it's the question, does my father delight in me? Does my mother delight in me? We need to know in the center of our hearts that the 2 people who brought us into this world just delight in us. It's the sense of, you are a beloved son. You are a beloved daughter. I delight in you. I just adore you. I enjoy being with you. It's the sense that that mom just loves to be in your presence. Dad teaches you how to ride a bike or throw a curveball, and he loves doing it because he loves being with you. If the deepest part of your heart never got the message that your parents delighted in you, or if one did and the other didn't, then you carry a wound inside your heart. Imagine you're a young girl who's trying to survive middle school, and after a particularly hard day, you are alone in your room, and your mom comes in. You tell her a little bit about what happened between you and some other girls who were cruel, and you tell her why you were so upset. And your mom looks at you, and she says, "Honey, maybe you're just too sensitive." Mom walks out of the room, and sitting on your bed, something whispers deep in your heart, "You're too much. Mom can't handle you. Maybe no one can." That's a wound. You don't just recover from that with time. Wounds can take the form of a rumor circulating in 7th grade, or the failure of parents to delight in you, or sexual abuse from a grandfather. Some wounds cut deeper than others, but you don't escape living in this life without having your heart injured. Now, why does the wound matter? I can put it in a simple sentence. Your wound is profoundly influencing how you are presently living your life. Your wounds have a profound influence on your present day-to-day life. I want to read 3 verses from Isaiah 61, in which the writer unfolds how our wounding leads us to make commitments that enslave us, sometimes for decades. And then the writer talks about what the path to healing looks like. This is Isaiah 61, verse 1 through 3. "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair." Isaiah 61. Now, when Isaiah says he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives, he's making a linkage. He's drawing a link between being brokenhearted and becoming a captive. And here's the link. When our heart is wounded and we pick up the pieces and mash them together, we begin living in a way that promises to relieve the wound and assures that we will never be hurt like that again. And this way of living enslaves us. So let me say it again. When our heart's wounded, we pick up the pieces of our hearts, we mash them back together, and then we begin living in a way that promises to relieve that wound, and more importantly, that assures us, so we think, that we will never be hurt like that again. And that way of living begins to enslave us. Let me flesh this out. A few months ago, I heard a man give a talk about one of his wounds. And when he was in 5th grade, he was really significantly overweight. He had a size 36 waist in 5th grade. And he tried to compensate for this by becoming the class clown, and it worked for a little bit. Except one day, the whole class had to do pull-ups in gym class for one of those national tests. And as he told the story, his voice cracked as he said, "I couldn't pull myself up. I just hung there, utterly humiliated in front of the whole class. And as I hung there, I thought to myself, I am so weak. I am not a boy, and I will never be a man." That night he went home and he decided that he was never going to be humiliated like that again. And so he went for a run. 4 houses is all he could do. He got down 4 neighbors, 4 houses. But for the next 2.5 years, he didn't miss a single day of running. And he went down to a size 29 waist. And he became quite anorexic and obsessive about exercise. His wound led to captivity. The progression goes like this. Your heart is injured as a result of sin in the world and its specific effects in your life. And then you become captive to whatever ways you devise to bind up that heart as best you can to protect it from future injury. This man was humiliated by his body, and he became captive to living in such a way that he would never be humiliated by his body again. Now, does he need to repent of that way of living? Well, sure, but far more, he needs healing. He needs healing of the wound that began as he hung from that pull-up bar. He needs to be set free from his captivity to obsessive exercise and hating his body and training it so that it will be strong enough to save him from any future humiliation. We become captive to those things that promise to protect us from being wounded in the same ways again. And the Bible calls this idolatry. What Isaiah is saying is that your idolatry grows in the soil of your pain. Your idolatry, your strategies for living, it is not random. Your idolatry differs from another person's, and it's because everyone's idolatry grows in the soil of their pain. There is a linkage between your captivity and how your heart has been broken. There's a reason you idolize financial security, and that reason is found in the story of how you've been wounded. Maybe you never felt safe in your house. You never felt in control. And now the only way to feel safe is to make sure you have enough money in the bank. There's a reason you are captive to being so driven and never being able to rest. And that reason is found in your story. Maybe your dad's approval was just out of reach. You got close to earning it, but not quite. And now you can't stop working and you don't know why. There's always a story behind this stuff, and it's the story of the particular way your heart was wounded. Now, before I go on to the next point, I just want to briefly mention one more reason that the wound matters, and it's perhaps arguably the most important. Your wound is the reason you are hurting people right now, including yourself. Hurt people, and we're all hurt. You will continue to unconsciously hurt people until you address your core wounds. It is inevitable. There's a reason you blow up at your wife when you do. It's not random. It's not that you're having a bad day. No, something happened between the two of you that triggered one of your wounds and your body reacted in anger. Okay, so what can be done about this mess? Each of us carries deep wounds in our hearts. And on top of that, we've become enslaved to living in ways that promise us we'll never have to feel that pain again. Centuries after Isaiah wrote this passage, a man named Jesus unrolled the scroll of Isaiah. And he read this very passage in the synagogue, and then he said this, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus was saying, I'm the one that the Lord sent to bind up the brokenhearted and to free the captives. The promise of Jesus to you today is the promise of healing. Isaiah is announcing the good news. Jesus was sent to bind up your broken heart, to heal you, to free you. The first step to healing is to realize that something can be done about your wounds. To realize that there is a person with the power to heal you. Psalm 147 says this, "The Lord heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." You don't have to wait until heaven for the healing of your wounds. You don't have to wait until heaven. Isaiah is saying Jesus was sent for the purpose of healing your broken heart. Why did Jesus come to earth? What is God up to in the world? It's not forgiveness, though it starts there. It's not even salvation, though it includes that. It's restoration. In the last chapter of the Bible, we see a picture of the new earth that God is creating. And this is what it says. This is Revelation 22. The angel showed me the river of the water of life. On either side of the river was the tree of life. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Why healing? Because that's what God is up to in the world. He is healing broken hearts. Now, in order to begin to experience healing, you've got to name your wounds. You have to stop running from them and confess what your heart already knows. You have been harmed by others, and it hurt, and you haven't gotten over it. It's not in the past. Remember, sin is a bigger problem than we think. When you're sinned against, it doesn't just go away. It has consequences in your heart. Will you name how you have been harmed? When we refuse to name how our heart has been injured, when we refuse to acknowledge the particular ways that we are brokenhearted, we are living in denial. And denial is not merely a defense mechanism. It is rebellion against God. A denial of your wound is a denial of God, because it is a denial of the harshness of the reality that God allowed you to experience. Many people deny their wound. They deny that it happened. They deny that it hurt. They certainly deny that it's shaping the way they are living today. The dilemma with this is that when we bury our pain, we bury it alive. It festers, it churns, it will not be ignored. It will crop up in sudden bursts of anger or sexual addictions or shutting down whenever you feel criticized. The question is, will you take your heartache, the wounds your heart has suffered, and show them to Jesus? Will you expose your pain to Jesus' compassion? Have you invited Jesus into the injured places in your heart? There are lots of obstacles to naming our wounds, but let me briefly address two. One objection that may arise in your heart is, there's no point in looking at the past. It's just going to hurt, and I can't change what's already happened. The claim of the gospel is that you can absolutely change what has already happened. You can't change the event. You can't make the wound not happen, but you can receive healing, which means that your brain can change. The way your brain remembers the event can absolutely change. When God heals, your brain changes. Your brain cells, your neurons become rewired. What the resurrection means in neurological terms is the rewiring of the cells that make up your brain. In other words, you can change the past. Another objection that arises is this: I don't want to blame my parents. I don't want to blame my parents. There is a difference between blaming and naming. This isn't about blaming your parents. It's about naming your wounds. Let me put it this way. The person I harm the most is my wife, Caroline. But next to her, the two people I harm most are Hope and Eli, my two children. Now, when they come to me in 20 years and they say, Dad, here's what it was like to live with you, and here's one of the ways you really wounded me, that will be a holy moment. They're not blaming me. They're giving me the opportunity to participate in their healing by owning how I harmed them and by seeking to make it right. There's a difference between blame and naming your wounds. Now, what do you do after you name your wounds? Well, it's at the end of verse 2 in Isaiah 61. And this is what he says. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who grieve. Healing takes place as we mourn, as we grieve. The way the broken heart mends is through grief. Grieving requires not only that you name your wound, but that you enter into the wound emotionally, that you feel. That's what mourning is. It's not enough to just cognitively name it. You've got to feel. Feel the sorrow, feel the hurt, feel the betrayal, feel. To grieve is to remember what happened with your full self, your thoughts and your emotions. It is calling the wound to mind and then feeling the sorrow that comes up. You have to honestly face up to feelings that you buried years ago, and it may take time. If you've pushed the sorrow down your whole life, it may take time. That's okay. But the key is entering into the story of the wound and hanging out there for a while, staying with the feelings that come up. And here's the dilemma. Many of us are constantly on the go. If you're constantly moving, it is very hard to grieve and mourn, because grieving requires being still and sitting with yourself. Barbara Kingsolver wrote a novel called The Poisonwood Bible, and one of the characters has a lot of pain, and she deals with it by staying busy. And this is how she explains it. It's beautiful writing. She says, "As long as I kept moving, my grief streamed out behind me like a swimmer's long hair in water. I knew the weight was there, but it didn't touch me. Only when I stopped did the slick, dark stuff of it come floating around my face, catching my arms and throat till I began to drown. So I just didn't stop." As long as you keep moving, you can keep your pain at bay for a time. Your grief will stream out behind you like a swimmer's long hair in water. You've got to stop to grieve. Now, if you take the time to grieve, something beautiful often happens. You are met by Jesus and you are comforted in your sorrow. This is what the text says. "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who grieve." Now, provide what? What is he providing? Well, it's in verse 3. "To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair." When you are faithful to enter grief, God provides beauty, joy, praise. And did you catch that last line? A garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. The despair is gone. Now, why does the text talk about despair here? Because God knows that when you name how your heart has been broken, when you dip down into grief, you experience despair. The floor drops out from under your life and you feel like you're falling through the earth. God knows that. The floor once dropped out from under his life, and he fell through the earth into the darkest depths. Why? Why did he do that? Well, a lot of reasons, but one of them is so that he could identify with you in your sorrow. On the cross, Jesus experienced the fullness of the sin that has been committed against you. He felt your wound. He knows what you feel as you begin to engage the wounds in your heart. He felt it all on the cross. He sunk down into the despair. It's stunning. And it's why he can actually comfort you, because he knows experientially what you're going through. So the progression is this. You name your wound. You enter into all the feelings, sorrow, mourning, grieving. And then something happens. You are comforted. You are provided with beauty instead of ashes, joy instead of mourning, praise instead of despair. It takes time. It doesn't always happen immediately. But do you believe that it happens? Do you believe that Jesus will catch you when the floor drops out from under you as you grieve the ways you have been harmed? If you don't acknowledge your broken heart, if you don't name your wounds, you will continue to live in captivity, but far more, you will miss Jesus. Jesus can lovingly remove all the layers of duct tape from your heart. He wants to painstakingly stitch your heart back together and make it come alive again. Thank you so much for listening. Hey, if you liked this episode and think someone else would also, please share it. You can do that right now from your device. There's a share button right on your phone. Or you can just email them and they can find it wherever they listen to podcasts. But please let others know about it. Thank you so much, and new episode next week. Take care.